"We'll eat first," the cook said. 15 minutes later, the sky over Midway was on fire. June 4th, 1942. Dawn broke across the Akagi's deck, flagship of Japan's carrier strike force. The air smelled of avgas, hot metal, and confidence. Below decks, men hurried through narrow passageways, hoisting bombs, checking instruments, cinching flight helmets. The Empire was sure of victory. Pearl Harbor had been avenged, the Pacific theirs. Today would finish the job. On the mess deck, a petty officer stood with his arms folded, an apron knotted at his waist. Exhaustion etched into his face. "They haven't eaten," he said flatly. "No one fights well on an empty stomach." The flight officer snapped back. "We launch in 15 minutes. The cook didn't blink. "Then they'll fly hungry." The officer, caught between discipline and doubt, relented. 5 minutes. That's all. 5 stretched to 10. Then 15. By 07:15, the flight deck was full of men gulping rice, soup, and green tea. 1,000 small domestic moments of chopsticks, clinking spoons, and laughter unfolding while bombs waited in open crates. 150 miles east, U.S. dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown were turning toward the rising sun. They didn't know that ahead lay 4 Japanese carriers with decks stacked with fuel, ordnance, and breakfast. On Akagi, the cook wiped his hands on his apron and nodded toward the bridge. "They'll fight better now," he said. He was right. But by the time American planes pulled up to their own ships, timing had shifted. At 10:20, 3 American squadrons dove out of the sun. Akagi's deck crews were still rearming. They had delayed for rice and miso. Bomb trolleys waited. Fuel hoses snaked across the steel like veins. The first bomb struck the ship's center line, where breakfast dishes had been stacked an hour before. The explosion split the vessel. In 15 minutes of kindness, the course of the Pacific War changed. By noon, 3 carriers were gone. By night, Japan's dreams of easy empire sank with them. The Imperial Navy trusted precision above all. Doctrine, timing, choreography. For 20 years, they had honed a schedule so exact that even meals were timed to the second. Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryu, 4 carriers, 4 floating factories of war, rehearsed launches with mathematical rigor. Every deck movement had an allotted second: 8 to arm, 10 to fuel, 3 to launch. If every man hit his mark, destruction followed like a clockwork. The Americans, in their minds, were improvisers, chaotic, instinctive. But there was one variable the Japanese hadn't computed: human hesitation. The cook aboard Akagi was Masao Tanaka, 39, once a fisherman from Nagasaki, now galley chief. He wasn't in any manual, wasn't in the plans. He fed men. On June 4th, his single, small act, 15 minutes for rice and miso, slipped between the teeth of a machine built on timing. The bridge recorded a new launch time, 07:15 instead of 07:01, and the ship carried on. 15 minutes didn't read as failure. It looked like discipline softened by mercy. Aboard the American carrier Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky stared at an empty horizon with orders to find the enemy or die trying. His pilots hadn't eaten either, but they didn't stop. 2 sorts of hunger were at work over the Pacific, one that delayed, one that refused. By 09:30, Akagi's deck crews were back to work, refueling planes returning from the initial strike on Midway. The next wave, a mix of dive bombers and torpedo planes, was being rearmed. Every man believed they had time. They always had. But precision breeds predictability, and predictability bleeds seconds. For a quarter hour, everything looked pristine. Engines humming, sunlight glinting off polished wings, the sweet metallic scent of avgas. Then radar returns began trickling in. Faint, confused, belated. Enemy aircraft approaching from the east. Admiral Nagumo hesitated. Was it a true threat or a false alarm? The first strike hadn't yet been fully serviced. Decks were crowded. "Launch what we have," an officer urged. Nagumo refused. "We must rearm for land targets." The argument went on while the galley clerk, washing pans, muttered, "This is too soon." Had the clock obeyed orders, 15 minutes earlier, the decks would have been clear. Aircraft aloft, hoses disconnected, fuel sealed. 15 minutes earlier, they would not have been eating. But routine, not insubordination, not weakness, had delayed them. And delay became death. To grasp that morning, you must understand how thoroughly everything had been planned. In early 1942, Japan's empire spanned the Western Pacific. Its navy seemed invincible. The strike group steaming toward Midway was the fleet's jewel. Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, Hiryu, carriers with 248 planes and 20,000 men. Below decks, fuel lines ran like arteries. Elevators fed aircraft up in waves. Chalk marks kept spacing exact. At 04:30, cooks began breakfast. At 05:00, flight crews briefed. At 05:30, the first wave launched for Midway. By 07:00, decks should have been cleared and ready to rearm. But by 07:00, men were still eating. When the first wave encountered stiffer resistance at Midway, Nagumo faced a choice: rearm for a land strike or switch to torpedoes for naval targets. Planes were mid-change, bombs being swapped for torpedoes, fuel lines still connected. An officer later logged, "Dangerous condition. Ordnance on deck." Meanwhile, 150 miles east, Admiral Raymond Spruance's task force, guided by code breakers who'd narrowed Nagumo's position to a box, turned toward the Japanese. The Americans didn't know about the breakfast delay. They didn't need to. Timing was already aligning against Japan. By 10 hangars, the Japanese decks were laden with planes, fuel, and exposed munitions, a perfect target. What the cook had deferred in minutes, the Americans erased in seconds. Kaga and Sōryū were still arming. Akagi's crew only half-finished refueling. Hiryu farther back was loading torpedoes. The very systems that made the carriers lethal now synchronized them for catastrophe. Japan had built a navy that assumed men would act like machines. But machines don't feel hunger. At Midway, the smallest human need, a meal, became a fault line that split an empire. Midway was an equation masquerading as chaos. Every number mattered. 4 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, 15 minutes of delay, 7 minutes from radar contact to impact, 40-odd seconds from bomb release to detonation. On that morning, those figures rearranged history faster than anyone could count. The Japanese doctrine treated time as a weapon. Their carrier warfare depended on synchronized action and cleared decks between sorties. A single interruption fractured the system. While the galley ladled rice and miso, flight decks turned into floating powder magazines. Fuel hoses stretched, bomb carts poised, engines idling, pilots strapped in as mechanics swapped ordnance. Each bomb weighed hundreds of kilograms. Each plane carried 2. Multiply that by dozens of aircraft and the exposed mass of explosives became immense. Aviation gasoline vaporized in heat, and, meeting a spark, didn't smolder. It detonated. On the American side, the math was no less precise. Dive bomber speed, descent angle, release point. The Enterprise's dive squadrons, late by American standards but perfectly timed against Japanese misfortune, dove from altitude, and the decks that had been delayed became infernos. The human delay that seemed trivial in a rigid timetable turned the carriers into targets of opportunity. Perfection in warfare is brittle. It breaks on the smallest human note. At Midway, 15 minutes of humanity toppled an empire's certainty. Impact delay 5 seconds. 5 seconds. That's how long it took for the laws of physics to turn human error into empire-ending destruction. At 10:20 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky's dive bombers appeared from the direction of the sun. They had been searching for hours, running low on fuel. ready to turn back, but McClusky had followed the white wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, a destroyer that by sheer chance was heading straight toward the carrier fleet. The destroyer's wake became a line in the sky. McClusky followed it, and at the exact moment when Akagi's crew was rearming its aircraft 15 minutes behind schedule, the American planes arrived overhead. 3 squadrons, 37 bombers, each with a single 500 lb bomb. From the sky, the Japanese formation looked perfect. 4 ships, decks gleaming, aircraft lined in rows. From the air, perfection meant death. The dive began. Engines howled as the bombers folded into the wind, dropping from 20,000 feet like falling blades. Japanese lookouts shouted warnings. Enemy aircraft 10,000 high. Too late. The guns weren't loaded. The crews weren't at their posts, and the decks were crowded with planes that couldn't take off. Akagi's air officer screamed into the bridge, "Launch now!" But the lift was jammed. The planes were still being fueled. In less than 1 minute, the equation closed. 1 bomb hit Kaga right through her flight deck. The second detonated inside Sōryū's hangar where rows of torpedoes were waiting. A third, aimed perfectly by Lieutenant Dick Best, struck Akagi's center line, exactly where the fuel lines converged. Each explosion multiplied. 1 became 3. 3 became 30. The firestorm burned at 1400 degrees C. The steel deck buckled. Men melted into the metal they stood on. From Enterprise, a radio officer recorded the timing. Contact made 10:20. 3 carriers burning 1023.3 minutes. That's how long it took to erase half the Japanese Navy's carrier strength. Not strategy, not superiority, just arithmetic. 15 minutes added to the wrong side of an equation. When historians later reconstructed the event, they traced every cause. Nagumo's hesitation, poor radar, bad luck. But the simplest line connected back to a single entry in Akagi's log. 7:15 breakfast served. 7:45 rearmament begins. That half hour was enough to turn the world upside down. Not strategy, but seconds. Not failure, but food. Not weakness, but warmth. 15 minutes of humanity that broke the machine. From 20,000 ft up, the Pacific looked like glass. Sunlight hit the surface in long ribbons. And somewhere down there, the largest Japanese fleet ever assembled moved like clockwork. Slow, precise, unstoppable. Wade McClusky's squadron had been in the air for hours. Fuel gauges read near empty. Radio chatter was static. Men were ready to give up. Then McClusky spotted it. A thin white scar on the blue. A destroyer running at full speed alone heading northeast. He didn't know it, but that ship was Arashi, racing to rejoin the fleet after chasing a U.S. submarine. McClusky tapped his compass. "Follow her wake," he said. Within minutes, the fleet appeared below. 4 carriers in a perfect square. Smoke from their stacks drew a line through the clouds. McClusky exhaled. "We found them." Down below on the Akagi, the deck crews were mid-change. Planes were being rearmed, refueled, repositioned. A ballet of motion and noise. The air rire of gasoline. Deck officers shouted for speed. The sound of clanging metal shouting and engines filled the air. Petty Officer Tanaka, the cook, had just finished scrubbing the galley. He was walking up the corridor when he heard the sirens. Not for meal call, but air attack. He dropped his rag and ran toward the deck. Above him, the sound of aircraft engines rolled like thunder. McClusky and Heisman tipped their dive brakes. The sky became a tunnel of screaming air from 20,000 ft to 2,000 in 20 seconds. The first plane leveled, crosshairs fixed on the Kaga. Bombs away. The first hit struck amidships, tearing through 2 decks before detonating near the torpedo room. The explosion threw men into the air like shrapnel. Flames shot 100 ft high. 2 seconds later, Sōryū took her hit. The bomb ignited stacked torpedoes, each loaded, armed, waiting. The blast was so violent it blew her flight deck off the hull. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, had only 1 bomb left. He aimed for Akagi. The carrier looked untouched, elegant, invincible. He saw figures running on the deck, fuel hoses coiled like snakes, planes lined for launch. He pulled his release lever. The bomb dropped, spinning, then struck just aft of the bridge. For half a heartbeat, nothing. Then the ship convulsed. The blast hit the hangar deck where 30 aircraft were being refueled. Gasoline ignited instantly. The fireball punched upward, tore through the deck, and lit the sky. Tanaka, still halfway up the corridor, was thrown to the floor. The lights died. Smoke filled his lungs. He crawled back toward the galley, choking, eyes burning. Everywhere, screams, fire, boiling metal. On the bridge, officers shouted orders that no one could carry out. The engine stopped. Communications failed. In 90 seconds, the Akagi went from flagship to inferno. McClusky circled once, saw the fire spread from one end of the deck to the other, then radioed, "3 burning, 1 escaping. The gods are with us." Down below, Petty Officer Tanaka reached the kitchen again. Flames had reached the storeroom. Rice sacks burst into smoke. He covered his face with a towel, dragged a wounded mechanic toward the corridor, and pushed him into daylight. When rescuers later found Tanaka's body, he was near the same galley door where he'd refused to skip breakfast. His hands were burned, still clutching a steel ladle. At 10:25 hours, Akagi's captain gave the order, "Abandon ship." On nearby destroyers, Japanese sailors watched their pride sink, its deck collapsing like a burning leaf. The ocean glowed red. McClusky's squadron turned home, fuel nearly gone, eyes fixed on the horizon. They had changed history in 5 minutes. Back in the U.S. carrier's ready rooms, no one talked about the cook, the timing, or the odds. They talked about the explosions, the hits, the smoke. But in the end, that wasn't the story. Because those perfect strikes only mattered because of what had come before. 15 minutes of warmth on a steel deck, a meal that shouldn't have happened, and a clock that refused to obey war. When the flames reached the fuel lines, when the carriers split open, when Japan's empire began to sink, it was already too late. Not luck, bottoming, not skill, but delay. Not strategy, but the smell of rice and fire sharing the same morning air. By noon, the Pacific was burning. The sky over Midway looked like it had cracked open. 4 columns of smoke twisting upward, each marking a dead carrier. The heat was so intense that even the clouds turned orange. For the Japanese Navy, the collapse wasn't a battle. It was a chain reaction. At 10:20 hours, Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū were hit. At 10:55, Kaga rolled to port and exploded. At 11:30, Sōryū went dark. 718 men trapped below deck. By 1300, Akagi's fires reached her magazine. Her captain, Aoki Tajiro, refused to abandon ship until the flames reached the bridge. The fleet's formation disintegrated. Smoke blinded gunners, radios went silent, and the sea filled with oil and debris. On the surviving carrier Hiyu, Vice Admiral Yamaguchi still believed the battle could be salvaged. He launched a strike against the Yorktown, unaware he was commanding the last working carrier in the Japanese Navy. At 1700, American planes found Hiyu and finished the equation. 4 ships, 4 hits, 4 hours. The empire of Japan's naval air power, built over 20 years, was erased before sunset. It didn't happen because of strategy. It happened because of sequence. A single 15-minute delay had shifted every variable. The first striker returned late. The rearming began late. The decks were full. And when the Americans arrived, the system collapsed under its own precision. The math was cruel and flawless. Each carrier carried 90 planes. Each plane required 200 gall of aviation fuel. On the morning of June 4th, roughly 72,000 gallons of gasoline were being pumped between decks, enough to turn steel into liquid fire. Once the first bomb hit, pressure tanks ruptured, aviation gas lines burst, feeding oxygen into flames. Bomb carts exploded like grenades. Men vanished where they stood. Japanese engineers had designed their carriers to be fast, efficient, elegant. They had not designed them to forgive mistakes. When asked after the war why Japan lost at Midway, One surviving officer said simply, "Because we were too perfect." Petty Officer Tanaka the cook never made it off the Akagi. Survivors said his last words were to another sailor crawling past him. "Go!" he shouted. "I'm staying." They thought he meant to die bravely. Maybe he just meant to stop running. The next morning, Admiral Nagumo watched his flagship burning from the deck of a destroyer. The wind carried the smell of cooked steel and sea salt. Someone asked if they should lower the flag. He shook his head. Let her burn with it. In his report that night, Nagumo wrote, "The enemy attack succeeded because of timing." That was all. But the truth was more fragile than that. It wasn't timing alone. It was a cook with too much heart and too little fear. 15 minutes. That's all it took for the arithmetic of empire to break down. Not enemy genius, but human error. Not failure, but sequence. Not the strength of bombs, but the weakness of routine. The Japanese had built a war on machines that never hesitated. But men do. And the hesitation, that small mercy of rice and soup, burned 4 carriers to the waterline. The U.S. Navy called it the turning point of the Pacific War. For Japan, it was the moment perfection betrayed them. When everything depends on seconds, compassion is a defect. And on that morning, one man's compassion fed the fire that changed the world. From the cockpit of his SPD Dauntless, Lieutenant Dick Best saw the fire before the bomb hit. A bright flickering wound tearing opened the horizon. The target below was the Akagi, the same ship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. He leaned forward against the stick. The plane screamed as it dove, wind buffeting the canopy. The altimeter spun down 10,000 TDF, 5,000, 3,000. He could see men running on deck, their movements small and frantic like ants in sunlight. "Steady," he said under his breath. He wasn't aiming at a ship. He was aiming at history. He released his bomb at 1,500 Paris. It hit just after the bridge, exactly on the center line. For a moment, the entire carrier seemed to freeze. Then it erupted, fuel and fire merging into one soundless flash. The blast wave rocked Best's plane, nearly flipping it. He pulled up, gasping, the heat clawing at his neck. His gunner shouted over the intercom, "Direct hit!" Below, the Akagi was breaking apart. Smoke poured from the hangar deck. Explosions rolled in waves, each one louder than the last. Best circled once, watching. He knew what it meant. That single bomb had undone months of Japanese dominance. The irony was unbearable. The ship that had once carried death to Pearl Harbor was now dying in its own fire because of one breakfast, one delay, one unnoticed moment of humanity. He radioed, "Target neutralized, returning to base." His voice was steady, but his hands shook. Back aboard the Enterprise, he reported to the ready room. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. Someone handed him water. He didn't drink it. How bad? Another pilot asked. Best looked at the deck at his boots, still trembling from the vibration. Bad enough to end them. The numbers confirmed it. 3 carriers hit in under 3 minutes. Thousands dead, Japan's strike force crippled beyond repair. Historians would later call it the turning point of the Pacific War. Best didn't care. He didn't think in symbols, only in targets and timing. But in his mission report that night, he added one sentence that no one noticed at the time. Deck was crowded with aircraft and fuelines. Must have been in middle of rearming. Aircraft and fuelines. Must have been in middle of rearming. That note became a clue decades later when analysts studying captured Japanese logs discovered the gap between their strike orders and rearming cycles. 15 minutes of discrepancy, the time that changed everything. When interviewed years later, Dick Best was asked if he believed in luck. He said, "No, I believe in moments." The attack had been perfectly timed by accident. Above him, the sun had burned the sky clean. Below him, the Akagi burned the sea. That day, no pilot on either side could know that the difference between victory and annihilation had been measured in minutes and decided by a cook, Not precision, but pause. Not courage, but coincidence. Not the might of fleets, but the frailty of hunger. And as the American planes headed home, their fuel nearly gone, the Pacific lay below them like a mirror, reflecting the cost of being human in a machine made for war. The sea burned for hours. By afternoon, Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū were drifting skeletons, their decks collapsing inward, their hulls glowing red through the smoke. The fourth carrier, Hiru, was still afloat, still striking back, but even her fate was sealed. On the Hiru's deck, Lieutenant Hiroshi Takahashi adjusted his flight goggles and tried not to look at the horizon. He could see the black columns where the others had been. 4 towers of fire rising into a sky too bright to look at. "They can't all be gone," he whispered. But the radio man said nothing. The silence was confirmation. Below deck, the smell of gasoline and smoke hung in the air, and near the galley, a sailor was kneeling beside a steel bowl, hands shaking as he scrubbed it. His uniform was streaked with soot. His name was known to few, just another cook, one of the thousands who fed the machine. He looked at Takahashi as the pilot passed. "They said Akagi is gone." Takahashi nodded. The cook swallowed hard. "I knew men there." "So did I," the pilot replied. The cook hesitated, then said softly, "They hadn't eaten before they died. I'm glad we have." The words hung in the air. Strange, almost indecent. But there was truth in them. He wasn't the same cook who delayed the Akagi's flight that morning. But the echo was there. Men like him existed on every ship, faceless, unseen, doing their small, ordinary work, while generals wrote plans in ink. And when the plans broke, it was the cooks, the clerks, the oilmen who stayed behind, cleaning the ruins. By evening, the Hiru was hit too. 4 bombs just like the others. The fire raced down her deck. Pilots who hadn't launched threw themselves into the sea. Takahashi never made it to his plane. The cook, still below deck, tried to carry water from a leaking pipe to the wounded. His hands blistered. His voice grew from smoke. One of the men he helped asked, "Why are you still here?" He said, "Because someone has to feed them until the end." Later, survivors would remember seeing him one last time, standing near the galley door, his apron in flames. When the Haru went down, the cook went with her. His last act, a gesture of care in a world built for destruction. After the war, Japanese historians studying the carrier logs discovered the sequence that doomed the fleet. The breakfast delay, the rearming window, the exact timing of the American attack. They pieced together the chain reaction and realized what no one had understood then. The disaster at Midway wasn't just military, it was human. One historian wrote, "We were destroyed by our own orderliness, by the idea that time belonged to us." The Americans called it a miracle of intelligence, a triumph of code breaking and courage. But the Japanese survivors called it something else. The day the clock turned against us. The cook's small act, 15 minutes of rice and miso soup, had set that clock in motion. He hadn't disobeyed. He hadn't plotted. He had only done what every man at war secretly longs to do. Pause. That pause, warm, merciful, human, was the crack that let history fall through. In the end, his story became myth. Some said he survived and wandered Japan in silence. Others said his name was erased from the records, lost in the smoke. But in the testimony of one survivor from the Akagi, found decades later, a single line stood out. He told us to eat quickly. He said we'd need our strength. We didn't know how right he was. Not command, but care. Not failure, but fate, disguised as compassion. Not the cruelty of war, but its one surviving kindness. And for the rest of history, every explosion at Midway would echo with the quiet sound of a spoon striking a bowl. When the smoke cleared over the Pacific, only oil and silence remained. The Japanese Navy had lost 4 carriers, 2 48 aircraft, and over 3,000 men. the United States lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 307 men. The difference wasn't luck, it was timing. The official reports written in Tokyo never mentioned the cook. They mentioned enemy advantage, unexpected air contact, delayed rearming procedure. In one line, typed cleanly and without emotion, the cause was listed as fleet readiness disrupted during breakfast service. That was how history recorded 15 minutes of humanity as a clerical inconvenience. The Navy's analysts called Midway a tactical accident, a series of miscommunications and unfortunate coincidences. But men like Admiral Nagumo, who had lived through it, knew better. He said later, "The gods of war are hungry for seconds. Those seconds were fed to them by a man who wanted his comrades to eat before they fought." After Midway, Japan never recovered. Its fleet shrank to defensive operations. Its aircraft production couldn't keep pace with American industry. In less than 3 years, the empire that had ruled the Pacific was gone. And yet, at the center of that vast collapse stood armament so small it almost disappeared. A cook's quiet insistence that men needed strength before death. The Americans studied every angle of the battle. They called it brilliance. The timing of the dive bomber strike, the code rears who predicted the attack, the leadership of Spruant and Nimitz. But buried deep in the post-war analysis was a single observation from an unnamed intelligence officer. Japanese carriers were discovered during a rearming cycle. Decks loaded, aircraft refueling. Such a window is unlikely to occur again in naval history. Unlikely, yes, but not impossible, because the window hadn't been created by strategy. It had been created by something far more unpredictable: compassion. In the decades after the war, Japanese historians argued over whether the breakfast delay truly mattered, but they couldn't explain away the coincidence. The time of the meal, the delay in rearming, the arrival of McClusky's bombers, it fit too perfectly. And so the myth became truth, and truth became legend. The man with the ladle had become a ghost in every history book about Midway, unnamed, unranked, but responsible for the sound that ended an empire. Not brilliance, but hunger. Not genius, but care. Not orders, but one man's refusal to let others starve before flight. The Battle of Midway is remembered for tactics and heroism. But the arithmetic of war is colder than that. 15 minutes, 4 ships, 1 world overturned. Sometimes the difference between victory and extinction isn't measured in courage. It's measured in the time it takes to finish a meal. Years later, when survivors of Midway gathered in Tokyo and Honolulu, they didn't speak about orders or strategies. They spoke about sounds, the hum of bombers, the hiss of fuel, the quiet clatter of metal bowls below deck before the alarms began. One Japanese survivor, now an old man, told an interviewer, "The last thing I remember before the explosions was the smell of soup, then light, then nothing." He didn't remember fear, only the warmth of breakfast and the taste of something that felt human just before the end. Historians would trace every factor: the couriers at Pearl Harbor, the dive bombers of the Enterprise, the hesitation of Admiral Nagumo. But the smallest, strangest link in that chain would remain a cook who believed men should eat before they died. In the U.S., the Battle of Midway became legend, the moment America seized the Pacific. In Japan, it became a ghost story. Every generation recounted it differently, yet the conclusion remained the same. The fleet, governed by precise seconds, was undone by a moment of compassion that lasted 15 minutes too long. In 1962, a Japanese naval archivist uncovered an unclassified memorandum composed weeks after the engagement. It read plainly, "Delay due to meal service 0715-0745. Deck operations resumed immediately afterward. No anger, no reprimand, just a record of time. The same time that unraveled an empire." The individual responsible for that pause was never identified. His rank was minor, his duties seemingly insignificant. Yet his shadow touched every chapter of the Pacific War. He neither wielded a weapon nor flew a plane, nor did he issue commands. He fed men, and in feeding them, he fractured the machine. For all the numbers and orders of war, a single human decision still holds sway. Not bravery, but benevolence. Not strategy, but seconds. Not destruction, but a fleeting act of restraint. Today, the Akagi rests beneath 17,000 feet of Pacific water. Somewhere inside lies the galley, perhaps even the ladle, corroded and silent. When divers first explored the wreck in 2023, they found the flight deck torn asunder, hangars collapsed. The ocean had sealed everything in quiet permanence. Yet one small portion of the vessel remained eerily intact. The kitchen, with metal trays, bowls, racks, and a stove partially buried in silt, as if awaiting a meal that would never be served. The man who once said, "We'll eat first," was long gone, but his presence lingered in the intervals between alarms, in the rhythm of breath preceding battle. In the end, history is shaped not by weapons or commands, but by acts of mercy misread as mistakes. And on June 4, 1942, mercy shone brighter than steel. Mercy shone brighter than steel.